Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew, where each week I answer a film-related question submitted by a member of the BMFI community. This week's question: Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless is often named as a groundbreaking movie. What makes it significant? Well, it is an early, though not the first, but an early entry in the French New Wave cycle of films, a series of movies from the very late 50s and into the first portion of the 1960s that were made by avant-garde group of French film critics turned filmmakers in response to what they saw as the tired sort of establishment film industry and film culture in France, and in part inspired by a rash of Hollywood films that were seen in relatively rapid succession in France in the years following the end of World War II. I should say that Breathless, which came out in 1960 and in France and in 1961 here in the US, was not the first French New Wave film. There had been a couple of others, but it was Godard's first feature film, and it was probably the most commercially successful French New Wave film, certainly of the first bunch, and obviously one of the most influential, in part because it had clearly been influenced by Hollywood pictures, particularly those starring Humphrey Bogart from the 40s and early 50s, as well as you can see some film noir influences in the picture as well. So why is it significant? Well, it's significant because it is a prime example, and as I said, one of the most widely seen and successful, commercially successful examples of the French New Wave, an influential movement. So what is the French New Wave, and why was it an influential movement? Well, as I said, the French New Wave, films by a host of filmmakers in France in the late 50s and early 60s, people with names like Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard, were originally film aficionados and film critics. Most, if not all of them, worked for a film journal known as Cahiers du Cinéma, which was very influential in the mid-1950s for putting forth a notion known as auteur theory. I don't want to get into it very much in this response because it's a bit outside the questions topic, but suffice it to say that these critics who were on their way to becoming filmmakers were very, very interested in making movies that reflected their view of the world and reflected culture and society as they saw it, and were reflective of how they thought film culture should be. And many of the members of the French New Wave were greatly influenced by Hollywood film, but at the same time were interested in deconstructing it, and were interested in pushing the boundaries of these sort of rules of conventional narrative filmmaking. So what you start to see in a film like Breathless, first of all, you see references to Humphrey Bogart. You see stylistic and musical and other homages to films noir from Hollywood of the 40s and 50s. But you also see different sort of techniques and style to the filmmaking, an aesthetic that many people would sort of call, certainly at the time it would have seemed like guerrilla filmmaking. The film is clearly not made with the budget of a Hollywood or French studio film, but it's also not made with the restrictions and the sort of aesthetic conservatism that those films tended to have. Hollywood movies, though this was starting to change, certainly by 1960, by and large, Hollywood movies were very invested in never challenging the viewer stylistically, and certainly never confusing the viewer. and never having sort of open-ended stories or narrative ambiguity or anything like that. And the French New Wave, as I said earlier, were filmmakers who were interested in films reflecting their view of the world. And it's not unreasonable to say that, life doesn't have typically very neat, cohesive narratives. It doesn't always have a direct, straight, immediate chain of cause and effect the way a lot of Hollywood narratives do, and certainly did back then. And so when you watch Breathless, you see a film that seems to meander a bit, that seems to have some gaps in the story, some depiction of events or assembly of shots that is open to ambiguity. And that was by design. That was how Godard and others in his movement saw the world and didn't understand why films couldn't reflect that. So that sort of approach, that more loose approach to narrative and to even to sort of internal logic in a way, is something that eventually would have significant influence on filmmakers far outside the French New Wave, and it would even in a lesser to a lesser degree make its way into Hollywood filmmaking. That over the decades of certainly the 60s and 70s became more open to some sort of narrative ambiguity and looser characterizations. In terms of aesthetic, you see things used in Breathless that would eventually become relatively commonplace in Hollywood film, but not really till almost the end of the 60s and into the 70s. Things like handheld, almost entirely handheld camera work. Certainly extensive use of handheld camera, even when it would become abundantly obvious with characters moving quickly and running and things like that. Comfort with handheld camera work. Less of a concern about continuity in the editing. There is a scene in a hotel room, or I guess it's probably Gene Seberg's apartment between Seberg and Jean-Paul Belmondo. That is sort of their time after they've had a tryst, and it's really not clear sort of over what period of time or exactly when this occurs as it unfolds. And they sort of move around the space, and they're kind of edited at different points in time in different places within the space, and there isn't so much of a concern for continuity as there was and certainly would be in Hollywood films. Also jump cuts, which is when there are two shots of the same person or the same object or the same sort of setting that are edited together, but they're not significantly different, as if you went from one position to clearly another position of the same object, but they're just slightly different. And it seems like a bit of almost like a mistake. It would have seemed like a mistake in a Hollywood film of that era, but has now become widely accepted in motion pictures. So those are some of the techniques that are at work in Breathless. It's a movie that is aware it is a movie. It is made by filmmakers who are very knowledgeable about Hollywood film and interested in challenging its conventions and disregarding those that it finds, that aren't worthy of being regarded or aren't essential to pay attention to. And for all of those reasons, that is why Breathless is so influential. There are others, of course, but those are the ones that jump out and the ones that would probably be most readily apparent to the most viewers. So I hope that sheds a little bit of light on the importance of that particular film. If you have a movie-related question you would like me to try and answer, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and use the Ask Andrew form to send it in. Who knows? Next time I could be answering your question.